So thank you very much for taking your time out of your afternoon in an extra busy week for all of us as we try to begin to normalize some pretty radical life changes for everyone. And in addition, you're meeting your students and for a lot of instructors in a very different way. Perhaps you mostly teach face-to-face or have only taught face-to-face, and so this week is beginning to feel quite different. So just thank you for taking time out of this week and realizing that being thoughtful with culturally responsive instruction in a remote modality is really important and something that you should consider, from the beginning of teaching your course. The way today or this hour is going to work, I think you can imagine this more like a podcast meets an interview meets a facilitated panel. We do hope to have some time for questions. Peter is going to watch the chat for us, and if there are some follow-up questions that we have time for, we'll address those. Otherwise, we may leave them for the end. This is a huge topic, and I do anticipate there will be lots of things that you'll want to know more about or discuss with your peers that may be something that we can do in a later session or two for this term. I wanted to start with having the panelists introduce themselves, and I wanted to thank them. They are all directly involved in one-on-one faculty support. They're supporting folks in their division, and I appreciate them being willing to pull this together so that we could begin talking about this early in the term. So I'll turn it over to them to introduce themselves.
Okay, hi everybody, this is Peter Seaman. I'm on the online learning staff and I work for Heather. I should say I'm happy to work for Heather. I got involved in work around culturally responsive online teaching about 2 years ago. There are a couple of groups that, that I've started that are looking at this issue, and actually we did an inquiry group last year, and then this year we had enough people interested that we started 2 groups. We called an exploratory group and then a beyond exploratory group. And they're looking at various aspects. And we even got a grant from POD for part-time participation in this effort. So if you're interested in meeting with a small group and talking more about these issues, you can contact me and I can get you set up to join a meeting with our group. It's a little bit structured at this point because we started it in the fall and we did it in winter term, and now spring term our grant runs out. But we'll probably do some things next year as well. So if you're interested, please let me know. Thank you.
I am Casey Twining. I'm Instructional Technology Specialist over at Rock Creek campus. There's one of us at each campus. So you may have worked with one of my teammates. But basically, I assist faculty with implementing technology, and my role on the team has really been to find ways to put these concepts into practical use inside of the LMS. Yeah, and so I'm here for you guys as you hopefully explore this topic a little bit further.
Hi, I'm Stacey Williams, and I teach in communication studies at Rock Creek, and I'm also an online faculty mentor and have been part of the early group and the second book group that Peter was talking about earlier. So it's great. I recommend it if you're interested.
This is Max Macias. Hi, I'm a part-time librarian and I work in the IT department. I'm really very interested in culture and information and its relationship to education. So yeah, culturally relevant pedagogy is really interesting to me. So here's something I've started doing recently is I use a slide when I introduce myself, and it talks about some key things that impact my interpretation of the world. And I think that I got this from another instructor. I went to an OSU online meeting and a lecture, and they did this at the beginning, and they talked about how, you know, we're all subjective beings, and what are the things that impact what we learn and how we learn and impact our information interpretations. So I thought it was a great thing, and I started doing it. And so these are some key things about me that impact how I see the world. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks, Max. You're already getting some tips and strategies, so this is great. I'm going to start with kind of a broad overarching question, and I'm excited to hear from the panelists because I know they've given this lots of thought for quite a long time. So considering the context that we're in with this really, massive transition to remote teaching and our lives changing very much in a short period of time, what does it mean to you to be a culturally responsive educator in online classes or remote teaching? And we didn't talk about this in advance as a panel, but I think you're okay with just going ahead and interjecting as you want. And if that doesn't work, we'll move to the raise hand feature. So who'd like to go first on that
hi,
one?
Heather. This is Peter. Let me just take a quick stab at something, because I've been thinking a lot about this lately. And maybe I'll just go back a little bit to mention something that I think is most important about just being culturally responsive in general. And that is just thinking about what it is that makes you feel comfortable in an educational setting. And when I think about my own experience in educational settings from the time I was little, I say this a lot to people when I talk about my history in it, that I always felt kind of comfortable and as if I belonged. And I think it's important to think about how you would feel if you didn't feel as though you belonged.
This is kind of related to what Peter said. Like, I think it's really important just to make a welcoming atmosphere and to be calm and to make it a atmosphere that's okay to make mistakes, and a comfortable atmosphere. That's really hugely important in all of this stuff to me. And anytime I interact with people in teaching, either physically or online, I want it to be a comfortable, good learning experience. And to me, that means, the old learning organization thing where, like, it's okay to ask questions and it's okay to be wrong sometimes. It's great to learn from your mistakes. Feel comfortable. I think those are main key things that are related to this topic that people can really relate to. Everybody can relate to that, and it's really important. That's what I'd like to say about that.
Max, I put the Kozlowski quote on the screen. I don't know if you want to comment a bit about that.
Yeah, so I'm constantly encountering people that I don't know their backgrounds, right? They might be from Eastern Oregon, or they might be from Idaho, and I don't know those places very well. And I listen to them and try to get to know them as best I can. And I try not to make any assumptions about those people, because I know what it feels like when people make assumptions about me. It's not a good thing. So anyway, yeah, I think though, the bigger picture for me is just like, make it a comfortable environment that people feel safe in, as far as like learning, right? They're free to ask questions. They're free to make mistakes. I think that's a horrible thing. Like in American culture, I think that there's a real like this attitude that mistakes are bad, or like we only show the best things we ever do, right? Well, like, I think it's really important to learn from mistakes.
I'm also thinking about the kinds of mistakes we'll make as instructors, especially if teaching in a remote manner is new for us, right? And our students seeing our own resiliency when the technology doesn't work as planned, or you tried to do something in Brightspace and it wasn't successful. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to be transparent with our own mistakes that are going to come up, and learning from those as we transition. Is anybody else from the panel wanting to comment on this one?
Yeah, I would love to comment on this. I'm here to obviously support in a technical capacity, but after having studied this quite a bit within PCC, and also in I'm currently in a Master's of Education program, this has come up quite a bit. And especially this power dynamic that has been kind of handed down within education, where this quote speaks to the teacher being a knowledge broker and relinquishing in that in favor of being more of a facilitator. And so it's like this can be in big and little ways, which I'm sure we'll get to, but it's really, I think, a reorientation to the education being a collaborative experience for both the instructor and the student. So there is certainly expertise, there's like an exchange of expertise, but there's also creating an environment and opportunities for the student to bring forward their own knowledge that can help enrich the entire conversation, perhaps even some of the curriculum.
And I'll just chime in and say that for me, all of the things that have been shared, I think, are fantastic and things I agree with as well. But the way that I've kind of distilled my understanding of culturally responsive teaching and why it's important, or how I see that in practice, it has to do with it's bringing the human element to your class, and that means vulnerability and mistakes and all of the things that were talked about by Max and by Casey. But those are all actual valuable pieces of learning. And I think one of the best things we can do to be culturally responsive is to practice kindness in our online classrooms and really see that as a way to open up learning instead of blocking or gatekeeping people from engaging and learning and growing and collaborating with us.
Yes, thank you. So some of the other questions we're going to talk about is just thinking about the online context or the remote context, as you may be very familiar with employing culturally responsive techniques in a face-to-face setting. Which things in an online setting are a little easier to do, perhaps, and which things are harder? And then we're going to talk a bit about best strategies, best practices, and the tools, the actual tech tools that can facilitate a more culturally responsive online environment. And even talk a bit about managing discussions and, when issues arise in discussions, and then leaving a last bit of advice for the rest of us. So if the remote teaching is new for an instructor, what is your advice? What should we focus on initially to have a more culturally responsive remote teaching experience? So those are some of the things we're going to get to. So strategies, tools, and some of the classroom management pieces. I know these panelists have spent at least the last year and a half thinking about how to apply what they've learned about culturally responsive instruction to virtual environments. So this is that question. Which things do you think are easier to achieve in an online environment, and maybe which things are harder? So I'll turn that over to the panel.
I'd like to kick it off with perhaps one of the easier things. I think the syllabus is one thing that is sort of a great first step in examining your syllabus through the lens of culturally responsive communication with your students. What is that syllabus telling them? Not just the explicit requirements for the course, but what is it telling the student about you, about your teaching style? Perhaps you do have an explicit area where you talk about how you're going to be teaching, your overall philosophy, but in examining how you are telling students about these things and looking at it from the perspective of a not this old syllabus statement kind of cracks me up. It was in our template for years. We were coming from the point of view, of course, that, it's a contract. You as a student need to take this seriously. And certainly there's space for, solemnity when it comes to them being a student, but we're trying to pivot away from that, something less draconian, into something more of an agreement, right? What's the difference between a contract and an agreement? And so we did have some tips on redesigning your syllabus, but it was also really a helpful exercise to look at your language and look at opportunities where you might be using a bold, all capital letters. How can you change that language? And here, Heather's showing there's also something called a user manual that I picked up from the D12 Fusion conference last year. It was really interesting. It was a teacher coming from the point of view of giving his students kind of how to hack this class in a way, how to be successful in this class with him in particular as a teacher. And I thought that was very interesting, kind of reversing the normal disclosure between teacher and student. And in that way, he's also modeling, it's okay to be a specific person, you know, coming from a specific point of view.
Yeah, Max, did you want to talk about the use of images and how that's an opportunity in an online class that's harder to do when you're printing a syllabus?
Yeah. So I just got an image that kind of represented me, part of my culture and part of my background, and I used the lowrider there to convey this. It's the same kind of thing as a good presentation, right? You for a good presentation, you get a killer image and you use that image. You don't have like extra stuff on it. Anyway, so I used that, but I also changed some language in my syllabus. The late statement that I used to have was really legalistic, kind of like that contractual language, and I changed it to something that was more friendly. Again, like I'm focusing on like being friendly and being like a helpful, a coach, not a gatekeeper, not the arbiter of whether they're going to get to advance to a higher lifestyle, etc. I'm like a friend, right? Yeah. So things happen. I'm late. What do I do? What happens if I turn in my work late? We've all got real lives, and you know the world's a complicated place. And let me know as soon as you can if something's going wrong, and then we can work together to help. And then I have, you know, at the end of this class is only 5 weeks long, so there's not much leeway. So, but I'm trying to be like approachable and nice, and like not like super like, well, everything better be perfect here. Again, trying to be comfortable and friendly. Right. So yeah, I changed it. The other language was like, if you're this far late, then this is going to happen. If it's, you know, it was almost like a countdown, like a timeline of the consequences, the castigations they're going to get for being late. And I didn't like that. So I changed it. So it's worked pretty well for me.
Yeah, and I think this is really relevant with what we're experiencing with all of the challenges students and as instructors were facing in light of the COVID-19 response. That need for flexibility. We know students are, you know, just maybe getting internet at the end of this week or devices next week to, you know, begin completing your courses. And I also think that for a number of faculty, there's a huge learning curve in these first few days too. So I encourage you to be gentle to yourselves as instructors and also consider how students' lives have also drastically changed in just a matter of a few weeks. Did anybody else want to talk about syllabus strategies and or things that are easier to do online or a little bit harder and a strategy you have employed?
This is Peter. One thing that I think is more challenging in the online environment is just getting to know your students, because I think that you don't see them. And of course, we take a lot of cues from what we see in people. And it's one thing that I think is kind of exciting about Zoom as a tool, right? If you are able to meet with your students in Zoom, you can get some visual cues about your students. Now, of course, visual cues don't tell us everything, right? But they do give us some information. So I have felt for a while as though I've needed to work harder in the online space to find out about my students, and to try to make opportunities or look for opportunities where I can interact informally with online students. And that's kind of hard to do. And so one strategy that another online instructor who's much smarter than I am told me about is she keeps a Google Doc about all of her students. And so she'll write down, if she has an interaction with a student, she'll make some notes, something that the student told her about you know, the student's life, or about what's going on, or you know, any of those things. And you know, it's kind of hard to do when you have like 100 and 120 students or whatever. But I'd recommend trying that. I'm going to try that again this term to try to be a lot more intentional about finding out more about my online students, because I think it's kind of easy to treat everybody just, you know, like, you know, they're just an icon or whatever, but of course people are more than icons. And when I first started teaching, I thought that the fairest way to treat my students was to treat everybody exactly the same. And I've since come to think that that's the most unfair way to treat my students. Everybody needs to be treated in exactly the way that person needs to be treated, right? And so that's really a much more culturally responsive approach. So that's a little advice there. Go ahead, Stacey.
Well, what's funny is my thought is almost a little bit of the opposite. Like, I find that one of the great things about teaching online is that I can connect one-on-one with so many of my students. It doesn't seem like I'm harassing them if I send them emails connecting one-on-one. I think in the face-to-face classroom, they're like, but I see you all the time. What's wrong? Or am I in trouble for something if I'm doing a lot of one-on-one email outreach? So I think for myself, and it could be partially how I communicate, that like I do really well connecting in those one-on-one settings, but some of my best teaching experiences have been through a lot of those smaller one-on-one connections in the online setting, because it gives both of us time to think and reflect and process information to then connect with each other for all kinds of reasons. We're not always in a attentive, open, great headspace when we're in the classroom for that 2-hour period. So I find that the online setting actually gives space for people to be responding and engaging when they're in that space, to feel creative or to feel energized or to have a question or something like that to connect. And so I've really appreciated the opportunity to connect in smaller ways with more students one-on-one in the online setting. So maybe that's just a little bit of a different approach that Peter and I have in our personality types. I think maybe that's part of it. But I think that there's a great opportunity for you to seek out students one-on-one. What I will say though is that in online, you do have to seek out students sometimes a little bit more, because when they first enter your online classroom, it's just not the same as walking into a classroom with people and smiling faces and collaborators, and the space itself visually can look more sterile and just less personal and inviting. That's just the nature of an LMS. So, there's that challenge at first to overcome when the class first starts, but I think there's so many amazing opportunities to connect with folks.
Thank you. Do you have any, well, let's see. I would say to the panel, how many of you use an introductory discussion for students to get to know each other and for you to get to know the other students in the class? What has that been like for you? Do you have any tips and strategies for that introductory discussion and trying to build community? And then sort of on the other thing, as you might continue to use the discussion forum later in the term, and perhaps, you start noticing microaggressions, or, maybe somebody who's just not, it's just not appropriate what they're posting in the discussion, and all of a sudden something has gone awry. So both talking about the introductory discussion, how can you make that really great? And then how do you manage discussions thereafter? Because this will be new for a lot of folks.
Well, I'll chime in quickly for introductory discussions. Last year, I viewed a webinar that was actually part of our culturally responsive online teaching group, and she had put together some strategies for introductory discussions that are more than just what's your name and your major and what do you want to learn from this class, because that can become really formulaic. And so now I have this page that has several different photographs that I have captured and different words and colors. And I basically ask students to share their name and their pronouns, something about them, but then to pick one or more of those images, words, or sounds to describe what their week has been like so far, and then to connect with people who, maybe chose a different picture or sound that was like the next one they were thinking of using. And by engaging, I think, the senses in a different way, but also asking them to think not just in terms of words always, is a really interesting way to start conversations and for people to connect. So I think getting creative and playing with that, or even using some strategies of asking a student if there's an image either that they took themselves or that they found on the web or something that describes a feeling that they're having that week, playing with other types of ways to communicate visually or auditorily is a really interesting way, and is actually a qualitative research method called photo voice, which allows people to share their embodied experiences through images. And so there's lots of great opportunity to do that you don't always get in a face-to-face class.
It's a really good example. Does anybody else on the panel want to talk about introductory discussions or managing discussion strategies you've used for later in the term when things aren't going as well and you're still trying to have an inclusive environment and students have learned more about each other? What do you do then? I actually have an idea. I noticed there are a lot of online instructors in here because I recognize your name. I think this would be an opportunity to put this out to the rest of the group. And additionally, if you have a question or you thought of an example of something related to anything we've talked about so far that's been particularly effective, it would be great to hear from you.
Hi, I'll share. Similar to what Stacey was saying, I found that using images on the introductory assignment really resonates with a lot of the students. I've heard from several people that in some cultures that they don't want to post images of themselves. So for my class, Stress and Human Health, I'm often saying you can post a picture of your face or something that you find to be calming or peaceful, right, to try and tie it back into the class. And I've used variations of that, students posting images, because so many of them are really fluent with Google images and that sort of thing. So they, and they have to, you know, like put a sentence or two about like why they picked that image, but it really promotes more robust discussion when they see other people's images and respond to them.
I can imagine what images people would be using this week to describe what it's feeling like.
Well, for my class, there's a lot of like nature scenes or pets or people doing yoga or exercising, you know, and all kinds of things like that. But yeah, this week it'll be interesting to see how the images change.
I like the concept. I learned this from the online class we took from California, culturally relevant pedagogy for online teaching. The educational autobiography introduction, like what's your just a short autobiography of your education? Can you tell us, please? And I think that's really good because I can get a lot of stuff from people, a lot of ideas about education, how people have been treated, what works, what doesn't work. Because you think people will be talking about positive stuff and negative stuff in it. You get a lot of information from that, just an open-ended, like, how about your educational autobiography? I love that. That's really a good one, I think.
I don't know, Heather, if you want to talk about what you pulled up, but I can speak to a little bit of what I've experienced on discussion boards and how a teacher's presence can really make a big difference there. A teacher being active in responding to all of the participants in the discussion. Oftentimes, you know, the person who responds first will be at the top of the list, and so they will get the most responses. And so I think to really like create an inclusive environment where everybody has a stake in the discussion and how it goes, the instructor really being active on that discussion board is key. And you know, it's if you want to just stick with a text response, I think that's great. I know most LMS, including the one at PCC, you can have even like audio comments, and you can use media in your responses as well. But I think it's back to that kind of classic tool of redirection and just making your presence known, I think goes a long way.
I think that's a really great point, Casey. If you're thinking about using discussions in your class, I have a lot of instructors that will ask, do I need to read every post and respond to every student? And there's no easy answer to that, right? It depends on what your outcomes are, you know, for your course, what you want students to learn that week, how many discussions, how many students do you have? But I think if you are going to use a discussion, don't use it and walk away from it. Does that make sense? If you can't check in, sometimes faculty will summarize themes in the discussion. So not every student necessarily is getting a response from the instructor in a discussion. Sometimes that can actually be stifling if you want students to talk to each other. But checking in on that discussion and then redirecting, or if there's behavior that's just not appropriate, you can work with online learning and we can help you remove a student for, you know, a class period as you would face-to-face, and then help them return to the learning community in a way that might be more successful. But my advice is don't create a discussion and leave it. And additionally, if you're having some challenges, contact online learning, and there are ways that we can help students, better engage in appropriate ways in the course. So don't feel alone or scared to use them.
I'll add, if you are going to respond to some of your discussion threads going on in your class, but not all of them, I create a Google sheet that has all of my students' names and then a column for every week, and I track who I respond to so that I don't get drawn to some of the same students over and over again. I really want to make sure that if I'm responding to like 40% of everybody every week, that by the end of the quarter, there's been a really great distribution of that, because I don't want students to feel like I'm somehow valuing the contributions of some over the other. And I think there are all kinds of perceptual ways we could talk about how we sometimes are drawn towards some student posts over others. So I really try to make sure that I give a great distribution of time to everybody in the discussion. And I think that that usually works well, so that they feel like I've connected with them and they've been heard and we've had the opportunity to connect with each other. So a very impersonal tool like a spreadsheet can actually help you be more personal and connect with your students, just keep track of what's going on, because it can kind of be hard to view all of that easily at a glance in D2L. So a quick spreadsheet can be really helpful. And that's where I can keep track of like interests or things that students talked about in their introductory post and find ways to maybe weave that into my response to them, or connect course content to their interest or something like that. So if it's all in one place, it's a lot easier for me to see who I've connected with and weave in the things that they've shared are important to them.
Thank you. I did share on the screen some questions from a blog post that Heather Mayer had written for us. And these might be something you could adapt for an initial discussion post, or maybe even an initial assignment. There are questions, for example, what was the story of the United States that you learned in school? Heather is a history instructor. How has media influenced your understanding of US history? If you did not grow up in the United States, how did the history of the US intersect with that of your home country? What were the impressions you had of the United States not living here? And so just thinking about, we learn things about students, like their parents and, their caretakers for other, people in their household or their families. But additionally, there's opportunity to help students think about how those really shape how going into this next learning experience. Okay, I think we'll move on to talking about tools. So to the panelists, and for those of you teaching online, maybe you can be thinking about this too. What are your favorite tools that might be easy to learn and seem really effective for making communication, with students more personalized, reflect authenticity as an instructor, a sense of caring? What tools do you use? We can write feedback to students in emails or a graded assignment, but what else are you using that you think is worth folks giving a try if they haven't?
Hi, this is Peter. I just wanted to give a quick shout out for the, and I think many people are doing this now, but the 3-minute audio and video files that you're able to make as feedback in an assignment in D2L. And I found that to be extremely helpful. And I've also asked my students to submit short audio and video files to me in lieu of assignments. And I found that to be extremely revealing. You find out all kinds of things about people. Like right now, for example, as I'm looking at all of your video windows in the computer, I see things in the backgrounds of your videos, and it tells me a lot about who you are. So anyway, I just recommend that as a quick and easy thing that you can do in the online space to find out more about your online students.
I'll add on to that and say that I love using Video Note. It is my new favorite tool. And I think actually they're no longer 3 minutes. I think they upped the time the last time I looked, which is good because I actually have student speeches and public speaking that will be more easily facilitated with it not being capped at 3 minutes. Although 3 minutes is usually sufficient for feedback on an assignment. But last quarter, I started trying to give about half of my feedback to students on assignments using video note. And I had students send me emails thanking me for the feedback that I gave them. And I thought I used to write like really good detailed feedback. I probably stressed out about it too much and was like, are they gonna read it with the right tone? Are they, all those things. I started just doing the video notes. I am me, I am very real. Sometimes you hear my dog walking around. Sometimes I lose my train of thought. I pause, I get back on track. And I just try to authentically give them feedback on, what I'm seeing in their assignments and encouragements for their next assignment. And so I have found personally that if students were willing to write me an email just to thank me for feedback, that must have been a tool that was somehow connecting with them in a different way than than I had previously done. So I know it can be weird if you're not used to making video, and I'm an introvert. I don't love broadcasting myself out there, but it has made such a difference in how I think my students feel like they know me as a person, not just a computer screen. And then I've encouraged students, if they get writing fatigue, to submit a video for an assignment instead. And that sometimes also when a student is maybe struggling, they're hung up on the writing mechanics, maybe sometimes the way I get hung up on that a little bit, trying to make it perfect. I'll just tell them to record a video or audio note if they're comfortable with that, and that I'll take that as their submission. And so sometimes I think we can actually capture some of our best students' ideas and energy by giving them a different modality or tool for completing the same work. And so I have found that it has so drastically changed how interactions go in my class that I won't stop using video note.
Does a video note, does that caption, like, because I've been using video for a while in my IT job, right? Like I learned a long time ago, like just send them little snippets of video and then they can get it, like instead of writing some crappy writing. So anyway, does that caption? And can you get the video out of D2L? Because that's one thing I've noticed, like sometimes I put stuff in there and it's kind of hard to get to, like if I want to use a video outside of D2L, right? Can you get to it too?
That's a good question, Max. I was watching that Casey put some notes in there in the chat, and one is to remember how long the video you're creating is stored. So it's something to think about when you choose a tool. If you need something that will last a really long time, you have to maybe do something different. And I'm not sure the answer to the question on captioning. It's a really good one. Casey, I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that, or use of video notes, video feedback.
Yeah, so as of right now, the video note is up to 30 minutes, Stacey. That's probably what you saw, which is awesome. And so those are available for you to insert in your content all over the place inside of D2L. When we're talking about assignment feedback or like grading feedback, that might still have the time limit of 3 minutes. As far as captions, video note does not caption. And as far as retrieving them and downloading them, these are not really like durable videos, I think, by and large. It's like feedback for one specific person. If you're interested in making, more durable videos, we have a separate tool, Kaltura Capture, that is available to you to make, perhaps you have a welcome announcement that is okay to be canned, right? And you can reuse it if you use Kaltura Capture. Video note, yeah, again, the storage is a lot less than Kaltura Capture, but it's different levels of like, what is the purpose of this video? And having that video feedback tool, I think is really great to just humanize, your feedback for the student, to personalize it as well.
Great, thank you. There's a good question in the chat. What is your suggestion to remedy the situation of none to minimal response to a student's discussion post? I will always respond to the post, but as the course progresses, I see a trend of students responding only to specific students' posts in all discussions, and some students are told to, respond to numerous discussion posts. So I'm imagining being the student that no one responds to on a weekly basis. I have some tips for how I've dealt with that, but I'm curious if others would like to share what they've done. And this is a common problem.
I'd say if it's a problem that's happening, like you've seen it happen for a couple of weeks, you can always change what you're doing partway through the quarter, and instead just in a Google Doc or something say, hey, look, I'm going to break people into smaller groups for some of the discussions, like you 5 folks and you other 5 folks, like all of you. I'm looking that you'll kind of form a smaller group, make sure that you get in and view these peers' posts and respond to them, that maybe changing the structure like that a little bit can be helpful. And you don't have to use the groups tool in D2L to do that. You can just post and say, hey, we're going to try peer groups for our discussion forums. So it's a little easier to make sure we read some and respond to them. And so that's an option there. But I personally, my teaching style might also be the next week when I make an announcement. I usually make video announcements every week, recapping how I saw things go last week and celebrating things that worked out really well. I would probably also though say, hey, I noticed that there were a few discussion threads that got a lot of attention and some that didn't. Remember, we're trying to connect with everybody in our class, so make your top priority being finding somebody who hasn't yet had a response when you get into the discussion. And so I would just make that proclamation of something that I see happening, and I'm hoping that more folks will connect with each other. So it's a couple different ways you could think about getting discussion feedback spread across the forums.
I found that strategy effective, both, putting folks into groups and even changing those groups up throughout the term, maybe at 2 or 3 different points. So they're having a conversation with a smaller group of people, especially if you have a class of 35, it can be, really difficult. And then there's a little more accountability, right? I'm in a group of 5 people, and if I'm not really participating, it becomes clear rather quickly. I'm no longer, anonymous, number 35 of 35 students. We posted voice thread, which is another tool to engage students in a discussion. And there is a link to that as well. Okay, we have just a few minutes left here, and I would love to open this, in fact, to everyone. What's your advice in the first couple weeks of the term here? You're obviously instructors who care very dearly about, culturally responsive learning spaces, and, you're thinking intentionally about your design. Maybe you have a lot of experience, and so you're thinking of a lot of things you've tried in the past that you might try again. And then some of you are pretty new to the remote teaching. So I'd like to open this up to everyone. What do you focus on in the first couple of weeks if you're wanting to, build community and create a learning space that is inclusive?
One of the things that I do, hi everyone, it's Lisa George. Hey. One of the things that I do is I a lot of times will give students something to read about calling in versus calling out, and creating, like literally thinking about creating a culture in the online space, and have students as one of their opening exercises create collaboratively a list of class guidelines for communication based on their understanding of cultural differences. So it immediately calls culture into the space from the beginning. It cues to people that I am someone who cares about that, and that it's actually going to matter in this course. And it also does a lot for building community. And then another thing that I will ask is, instead of just like asking students to introduce themselves in a sort of, you know, a way that is easy and a little bit sophomoric, I asked them to, kind of along the lines of what Heather did in her post, ask them to tell me something about what they know about culture from their own perspective. So it really brings together in the first week or two this understanding of what culture is, why it matters, how we're all going to be like respectful and honoring of each other, and still bring that spirit of inquisitiveness into the space also. I found that it works pretty well.
I'm going to recommend Google Doc as a great tool for that collaboration that Lisa was talking about. It's a way for students to be able to contribute. In this case, if it's around norms for communicating and being respectful, they can come into that document at any point, and you can restrict that document, of course, to just the students in your class, and you should. And they can add to it. They can make comments, and they can do that whether it's 2 in the morning or, 8 in the morning or noon.
Oh, I love that. I've done that before. What I'm doing this term is I'm having everybody in one discussion post offer like between 3 and 5 items, and then they have to go back and comment on other people's, the ones that they think are important or good. So it gets them talking to each other about it, and talking to each other about what other people have talked about in the LMS, which I'm really concerned about sticking to in this term of remote teaching. Do you think that it's better, Heather, to stick to the LMS, or inflict Google Docs on people in the first couple terms of remote, the first couple weeks of remote?
Yeah, it really depends on your students' familiarity with both the LMS and the Google Suite. And the idea of surveying students, I actually got from you, Lisa, around what technology they have available this term, what devices they're using. So if you have a feel for that and level of comfort, then you can make a better choice for your class. The Google tools are all, they all embed nicely and work well in the LMS. So that is one good thing. And they can also be used outside of the LMS in an asynchronous way too, if students only have limited time where they have internet. But I think that idea of the survey, which you had shared with me at a different time, is a really good one to figure out what's going to work for your students. Okay, any final tips or advice, or just closing remarks, or things you'd like to learn about in maybe a future session on culturally responsive remote teaching? So what other things are sort of sticking for you? You can either say them or put them in the chat, and we can think about adding those for future discussion.
I'll add as a quick strategy for the start of the quarter that while it might be a tiny bit time consuming at first, I would encourage folks, especially if you haven't had a ton of interaction with your students in the online space this week, is just to send an email to everybody directly. And in fact, a short email is better. We all know how many long emails we've all been getting over the last week, and just say, hi, student, just wanted to check in and see how week 1 is wrapping up for you. Anything I can help you with? Anything you want me to know about you or how the class is going, and just kind of put that out there as you extending an open line of communication, so that maybe if a student hadn't felt comfortable commenting in public spaces in D2L with questions about the course, that you've opened that up and just said that you're constantly looking for ways to improve the class for students or do things that can help support their learning, and do that really collaboratively. And so just a short email to connect with each student might be really affirming for students. And if some students are having some technology issues connected to D2L or some of the other tools, then email is a really great place for them to connect with you while they're working some of those things out.
That's a great idea. I also think if you do a survey at the beginning, as I was mentioning, you could include that too. If you're going to be getting hardware and internet at a later point, when is that going to be? You can find that out too. So I see something in the chat, and that is about Google Docs as a collaboration tool. My advice would be honest with students. If you're trying new technologies, just be honest. They're experiencing, in most cases, using new technologies as well, and that you're going to be patient with them, and that you'll need their patience too. That's one piece of advice. Just be honest with the way things are, right? this is the way they are right now, and it's a difficult time for everyone. And then the other advice would be, you might have heard about some tools today and you want to go back and try like 6 different tools, or go into Brightspace because you're feeling a little more confident. Don't do that. You can get into tool overload. Small steps, pick 1 or 2 tools that you think are most effective for what you're learning about your students this term, and do those really well, and save the others for later in the term, perhaps. Any other final advice or tips?
I'd like to have an online session someday about how people use counter narratives in their class from a bunch of different perspectives, from a bunch of different subjects. I've been thinking a lot about counter narratives and how to build community with them. But it would be great to hear a lot of different people's viewpoints and experiences, because it's something I've been thinking about.
Max, is the hacking that you talked about, or maybe it was Heather, that's a counter narrative, right? Wasn't there something early on about how to hack this class?
If they try to hack my class, I'll give them a counter narrative.
I think you're talking about the user manual versus the syllabus, traditional syllabus. The user manual is like you're giving your students a guide to success with specific notes about you as an instructor. Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
I added that as a future topic, and we can grow this group. We can have different panelists, different folks present. So if you're interested in doing that, anyone, let me know. I'm going to leave this meeting open, although end the recording, so that the chat's open. So if you think of something in the next few minutes that you'd like to see in the future, put that on there. Thank you all. I know you're busy.
Thank you. Take care.
Thanks. Thanks, panelists.